My name is Dylan Noel, and today we're going to be discussing the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a portion of the immune system consisting of a series of nodes, ducts, and vessels that serve three primary functions: fluid balance, absorption of nutrients, and immune function. So let's start with number one, which is fluid balance. Around 90% of plasma that reaches tissues from arterial blood capillaries returns through the venous capillaries in the body. The other 10%, the remaining 10%, travels through the lymphatic system. So essentially the lymphatic system returns excess fluids and proteins to the body from the tissues that cannot return through the blood vessels. These fluids usually collect in interstitial spaces, which contain a number of lymph capillaries, and essentially these are found in most organs of the body, and then they connect to the lymphatic system as a whole. Any disruption of these capillaries can cause lymphedema, which is essentially just localized lymphatic swelling. So when you start to feel little inflamed dots around your body, this means that the vessels that are carrying plasma and that are carrying the lymph or the lymphatic fluid are being disrupted. So this can indicate poor health or some sort of illness. It can even be the result of certain serious medical conditions like lymphoma. The second function, as you can see here, is absorption. The lymphatic system assists with transporting fat, fighting infections, and removing excess fluid that otherwise could not be impacted, also through the lymph fluid. The gut membrane of the small intestine contains villi, which are finger-like projections, and these contain tiny, once again, lymph capillaries, these time called lacteals. Lacteals absorb fats and fat-soluble vitamins to form a milky white fluid called chyle. The chyle fluid, which is made up of lymph in addition to these miniature fat droplets, delivers nutrients to the body indirectly when it reaches the venous blood circulation. So essentially these nutrients wouldn't be able to get to the body otherwise. And then the third is immune function. The lymphatic system defends the body from potentially hazardous organisms by producing white blood cells called lymphocytes. Now, there are two primary types of lymphocytes. There are T cells and B cells, both of which, when they come into contact with bacteria, viruses, and other foreign particles, then form antibodies to fight those specific agents. So essentially, the lymphatic system as a whole forms part of the body's adaptive immune response. The adaptive immune response is basically just a series of highly specific and long-term or long-lasting responses to particular pathogens. So essentially, it's your adapted response to certain illnesses and to certain viruses. This is what the lymphatic system does. So in the lymphatic system, once again, we have lymph, which is basically just lymphatic fluid. Lymph fluid is a collection of fluids that drain from cells and tissues that are not reabsorbed into the capillaries, along with nutrients, vitamins, and other lymphocytes and other bacteria. This fluid travels all around the lymphatic system and is essential to the function of the lymph nodes, which we'll get into in a second, as well as the organs and vessels of the lymphatic system. So now moving on to the lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are small clusters of cells that filter out damaged cells, bacteria, and other foreign bodies from the human body. These foreign bodies travel from lymph nodes to larger vessels or vesicles. There are around 500 to 600 total lymph nodes in the human body, and these lymph nodes swell in response to infection due to the buildup of lymph fluid, due to the buildup of bacteria and other immune cells. The lymph nodes appear almost as small sprouting kidney beans, except that the sprouts for the beans are tubes that carry lymph fluid pretty much between the nodes and throughout the body. They're not even the size of beans. They're so small, like when they're uninflamed, they're the size of a pea pretty much. The body of the node is surrounded by a protective outside layer called a capsule, and then this is then divided into compartments called lymph nodules, which are just dense masses of lymphocytes and macrophages. The nodules are separated by lymph sinuses where the lymph fluid travels. Now, on the convex side of the node, we have the afferent lymphatics, which carry lymph fluid directly into the node, and then as it moves through the lymph sinuses and then through the lymphatic vessels, which are on the concave side of the structure. The concave portion of the lymph node is also called the hilum of the lymph node. It's basically just the concave opening region. This is in contrast to the convex side right here, which is where we have the afferent lymphatic vessels. So as we can see here, the lymph nodes are primarily located in the neck, armpit, otherwise known as the axillary region, the mediastinal region, which is basically just the mid region of the chest between the lungs. This contains all the principal organs of the chest and of the lungs. You also have a number of lymph nodes in the abdomen, both the upper abdomen and the lower abdomen, as well as in the groin area. So in the cervical region, we have the cervical lymph nodes, which there are 3 different types. We have the anterior cervical lymph nodes, which are nearest to the neck. These swell whenever you have strep throat or a rhinovirus, which is also called a cold. Then you have the posterior cervical lymph nodes, which are basically located behind a band of muscle on the side of the neck, and these often swell during infectious conditions like mononucleosis, also called mono. It's basically when you just get really inflamed globs on your neck. And then you have the occipital lymph nodes, which are located at the back of the neck and at the base of the skull. And these swell during infections like HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases. Now, in the armpit region, we have the axillary lymph nodes, which are located in the axilla, where there are usually about 10 to 40 total nodes. Looking to the clavicular region, we have the supraclavicular lymph nodes, which are just above the collarbone. An enlargement of these nodes would be a symptom of a serious disease like lung cancer or lymphoma. Then when we look at the chest area, once again, we have the mediastinal lymph nodes, which are pretty much just in the center of the chest cavity between the lungs. And this is where all the primary vessels and organs of the chest are located, including the heart. You can't really feel these, but they're there. Moving down to the groin area, you have the inguinal lymph nodes, which filter lymph fluids from the feet all the way up to the groin. And these become swollen due to injury, due to certain sexually transmitted infections and diseases, and as well as some cancers. So now let's look more so into the abdomen. We have the retroperitoneal lymph nodes, which are basically behind the tissues that cover the abdominal wall. These, for men, are the first nodes to swell in the event of testicular cancer. So if you have large kind of, globs of fluid, if your lymph nodes are inflamed in your abdominal wall area, that could be indicative of testicular cancer for men. Next, you have the mesenteric lymph nodes, which are deep in the abdomen, and they are located in the membranes that surround the intestines, so pretty much all in the belly area. And these often become inflamed in conditions like gastroenteritis. Obviously, they're located, in the membrane surrounding the intestine, both the large intestine and small intestine. So if there's swelling or inflammation there, that could be indicative of some sort of larger illness. Lastly, we have the pelvic lymph nodes, which are just located in the pelvis and the lower abdomen area. And basically, this is the area that contains the hip bones, the bladder, the rectum, and the reproductive organs. So these loads are pretty important. The 4 primary lymphatic organs are the thymus, the spleen, the contents of the bone marrow, and the tonsils. So the thymus is both a lymphatic organ and an endocrine gland, which is located behind the sternum. As you can see right here, this little red dot is indicative of the thymus. And basically this secretes hormones and is crucial to the production, maturation, and differentiation of immune T cells. So the thymus is located anterior to the ascending aorta, running down the middle of the body, and is posterior to the sternum. So its structure is an outer layer of a connective tissue, once again called the capsule, Inside that, there's the cortex, which is nearest to the organ wall. And this region contains T cell lymphocytes that are developing. Then inside of the specific cortex, there's the medulla, which is the region near the center of each lobule that holds fully formed T cells. There are also the epithelial reticular cells, which create walls that essentially divide the organ into a lattice of sections and hold the developing and maturing T cells. In the thymus, you also have a series of blood vessels around the capsule and around the lobular walls to supply oxygen to the organ's tissue. There's also the interlobular septum, which separates the lobes of the organ. And then inside of each lobule, you have the thymic corpuscle, which produces chemical signals that instruct dendritic cells in the thymus to induce the development of regulatory T cells. Moving on to the spleen right here. The spleen is not necessarily fully connected to the lymphatic system, but it is a series of lymphoid tissues that produce WBCs, white blood cells, including lymphocytes. And essentially these white blood cells filter blood to remove microbes as well as old and damaged red blood cells and platelets from the body and from the bloodstream. So the spleen is located in the, upper left abdominal cavity and is very similar to lymph nodes in shape and structure. The only difference between the spleen and the individual lymph nodes is that the spleen is much, much bigger. When looking to the structure of the spleen, you have the connective tissue capsule on the outside, which then divides into individual lobules, pretty similar to the nodes. There are two types of tissues in the spleen. First off, there's white pulp, which is essentially just lymphatic tissue and lymphocytes that surround arteries, specifically the splenic artery. And then there's the red pulp, which are venous sinuses that act as reservoirs for blood, as well as cords of, for lymphatic cells, lymphocytes, macrophages mainly. So essentially oxygenated blood enters through the splenic artery and then leaves through the splenic vein, for which lymphocytes in the spleen react to specific pathogens in the blood and attempt to destroy them. The macrophages then engulf the resulting debris, the damaged cells, as well as the other large particles. So the spleen essentially removes old and damaged erythrocytes from the blood circulation, as well as from essential organs in the body. Then there's the tonsils. As you can see right here, they're located primarily in the mouth region. Now, the tonsils produce lymphocytes and antibodies that help protect against inhaled and swallowed foreign bodies. There are three main types of tonsils: the pharyngeal tonsils, which are near the opening of the nasal cavity near the pharynx. There's also the palatine tonsils, which are located near the opening of the oral cavity into the pharynx. And then there's the lingual tonsils, which are located on the posterior portion of the tongue. So all of these sites contain lymphocytes and macrophages for protection against harmful substances and pathogens that enter through the nose or through the mouth specifically. Lastly, let's discuss the bone marrow, which once more doesn't necessarily consist of lymphatic tissue, but is still part of the lymphatic system. And the bone marrow is essentially where B cell lymphocytes of the immune system, this is where they mature. Now, the bone marrow forms a stem cell connective tissue that essentially fills the cavities of most bones. And its major function is the formation of blood cells, which is also called hematopoiesis. In terms of structure, there are a series of fibroblastic reticular cells. Now, these form a network in which the precursors for blood cells, both white blood cells and red blood cells, are found. Now, there are also fat cells which act as placeholders for bone marrow. And there's essentially two different types of bone marrow. There's red bone marrow and there's yellow bone marrow. The exact consistency of which depends entirely on the volume of reticulum cells and fat cells. So blood formation starts in a small population of hematopoietic stem cells in the red bone marrow, from which all cell divisions originate. Essentially, these cell divisions, these cells are capable of self-renewal throughout their lives. So let's move on to the lymphatic vessels. So as you can see right here, we have a series of green lines. These are basically indicative of the lymphatic vessels. Now, the vessels are tube-like structures that collect interstitial fluid and transport it to the nodes for filtration. So they essentially carry lymph away from active tissues and back to circulation in the bloodstream. So as you can see here, pretty much all of these green lines are lymph vessels. They begin with lymph capillaries, which are the smallest type of lymph vessels that ultimately feed into the subclavian vein, which basically returns the lymphatic fluid to the bloodstream. There's also a layer of smooth muscle surrounding the lymphatic vessels, which contract and propel the lymph fluid forward. Unlike blood vessels, which have a continuous closed loop system, the lymph vessels only carry lymph in one direction. So these muscles only contract to push the lymph in one direction towards or away from a specific structure. These vessels also contain valves that prevent backflow because you only want the lymph moving in one direction. Thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful.